The millionaire slammed a briefcase onto the polished marble table. Its clasps snapped open, spilling stacks of cash like a golden snare. "Prove to me you're not just another liar," Richard Alden hissed. His voice sliced through the glow of Christmas lights. Grace Johnson, the new nanny, stiffened. Just hours earlier, she had been singing Silent Night softly while stringing popcorn garlands with Daniel, the little boy who hadn't spoken since his mother's death. Now she stood under the icy glare of his father, accused before she'd even had a chance to breathe. Outside, Manhattan roared with holiday cheer. Church bells chimed, snowflakes swirled, and carolers laughed in the frosty air. But inside the Alden mansion, trust was a battlefield. Richard had seen too many employees betray him. Missing jewels, vanished secrets, even stolen inheritances. To him, kindness was only a mask for greed. Grace's dark eyes flicked toward Daniel. The child clung to her skirt, trembling, his lips parting as if he wanted to cry out. But silence wrapped him tighter than any winter coat. Richard leaned back, arms crossed, daring her to touch the money. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing shadows across his face, but the room felt colder than the snowstorm outside. On this Christmas night, one test would decide everything. Richard Alden had built his fortune with a ruthless precision that made Wall Street admire him and fear him in equal measure. But no amount of wealth could erase the night everything collapsed. On Christmas Eve, 7 years earlier, his wife Claire had bundled little Daniel into the car to fetch a forgotten gift. Snow fell thick and fast, blurring the winding aspen roads. The police told him later the tires had lost grip on the ice. Richard arrived at the hospital just in time to see the light fade from Claire's eyes. Daniel, only a toddler, was pulled from the wreck unharmed physically, but the trauma stole his voice. From that night on, the boy had never spoken a word. Richard buried his grief under contracts, mergers, and a constant stream of business trips. He poured money into speech therapists and specialists, but none of them could reach Daniel. The boy sat mute in classrooms, staring at chalkboards, or hid behind toy soldiers in his cavernous bedroom. Each December, when carols drifted through the city and snow blanketed the streets, Richard retreated further into himself, convinced Christmas was nothing more than a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. And as if fate wanted to sharpen his wounds, betrayal became his constant companion. One maid pawned jewels she'd sworn to protect. An assistant leaked boardroom secrets for a bribe. Even his own cousin sued him for inheritance rights. Each betrayal carved another layer of ice around Richard's heart. To him, loyalty was a myth, trust a liability. By the time Grace Johnson walked into his mansion, Richard's belief was simple. Everyone had a price, and everyone would eventually take what was his. Grace's past, however, was written in a different kind of pain. She had grown up in Atlanta's foster care system, shuffled from one temporary home to another, clutching the only keepsake from her grandmother, a small leather Bible with the words, "Hold on to the light," scrawled on the inside cover. Grace carried that phrase like armor. As a teenager, she dreamed of becoming a nurse, but dreams don't pay rent. When her younger brother fell gravely ill, she dropped out of school to support him. She worked nights cleaning offices, mornings waiting tables, afternoons babysitting children who weren't hers. Despite the exhaustion, she sang hymns to keep her spirit alive. After her brother passed, she carried the grief silently, never speaking of how she'd wept alone in the stairwell of a crowded hospital. The debts left behind forced her to take whatever jobs came her way, caring for strangers' children, scrubbing kitchens, or folding linens in hotels. Employers often underestimated her. Too soft, too hopeful, they said, in a world that rewarded only hardness. Yet Grace's gentleness endured. Every December, she volunteered at her church, wrapping second-hand toys in shiny paper so that neighborhood children would feel Christmas magic, even if their parents couldn't afford it. She had learned to live with less, but never to stop giving. Still, Poverty clung to her like a second skin. Each winter, she wondered if she'd have heat in her apartment. Each spring, she patched shoes until the soles gave way. And each time she prayed, she asked only for the chance to be useful, to heal someone, anyone, the way she had once dreamed as a nurse. So when she answered Richard Alden's ad for a live-in nanny, she hesitated at the sight of the iron gates and glittering chandeliers beyond. She almost turned back, certain that a billionaire's world had no place for someone like her. But she stepped forward anyway, clutching her Bible in her bag, whispering her grandmother's words. She didn't know yet that within this mansion was a boy who hadn't spoken since Christmas Eve, and a man whose soul had forgotten how to trust. And thus, 3 broken pasts: Richard's frozen heart, Daniel's silenced voice, and Grace's weary hope drew together beneath the weight of December snow, setting the stage for a miracle none of them expected. The first morning, Grace awoke inside the Alden mansion. Snow dusted the windowsills like powdered sugar. The house was beautiful, yes, gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, but also silent, as though joy had been banished long ago. She slipped into the kitchen, humming a soft carol, only to find the staff stiff with suspicion. Whispers about the new nanny trailed behind her like smoke. Grace ignored them, tying her apron, choosing instead to focus on the small boy she had been hired to care for. Daniel was sitting at the end of a long dining table, his legs swinging idly beneath the chair, a bowl of untouched cereal before him. His blonde hair caught the morning light, but his expression was vacant. When Grace approached, his eyes flicked up, blue, wide, wounded, and then dropped again. He did not speak, did not even nod. Grace knelt beside him. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said gently, sliding a gingerbread man from her bag. She had baked it the night before in the staff kitchen, wanting to bring something of her own into this cold palace. She placed it on the napkin beside him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Daniel's small fingers reached out, hesitant, and pinched the cookie. He broke off a corner and put it in his mouth. It was the smallest gesture, but Grace felt her heart swell. A start. From that day, she wove Christmas warmth into Daniel's routines. She sang softly while helping him with his shoelaces, traced snowflakes with him on frosted windows, and taught him to hang ornaments on the massive tree in the front hall. At first, Daniel only followed in silence, but sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his lips curved into the faintest smile. Richard noticed. One evening, he entered the drawing room to find Grace crouched by the fire, showing Daniel how to string popcorn onto thread. The boy's eyes shone with quiet concentration, and when a piece of popcorn slipped, he stifled what almost looked like a laugh. Richard stood in the doorway, stunned. It had been years since he had seen even a flicker of joy on his son's face, but old habits die hard. "Don't fill his head with nonsense," Richard snapped, striding into the room. Grace rose slowly, unflinching under his cold stare. "It isn't nonsense," she replied softly. "It's Christmas. He needs to remember what joy feels like." Her words unsettled him. No one had dared challenge him so directly since Claire's death. Yet there was no defiance in Grace's eyes, only conviction. That night, Richard lingered outside Daniel's bedroom door and heard Grace's voice drifting through. A lullaby, gentle and strong. For the first time in years, Richard couldn't bring himself to interrupt. Over the following weeks, tiny changes unfolded. Daniel began drawing pictures of snowmen and gingerbread houses, slipping them under Grace's door. Once, when she stumbled carrying firewood, his small hands rushed to help. He still did not speak, but his silence no longer felt like emptiness. It was full of possibility. Grace herself felt a change too. For so long, she had been the one on the outside, watching other families celebrate. Now, in the glow of Christmas lights, she found herself belonging, even if just for fleeting moments. She prayed each night that this fragile thread of hope would hold. And somewhere deep in his guarded heart, Richard felt the first crack in his armor. Watching his son lean against Grace's shoulder, he realized this woman carried something that money could never buy. What he didn't know was that the miracle he had stopped believing in was already beginning. Under his very roof, December painted New York in silver frost. The Alden mansion, with its garlands and glittering tree, looked like the cover of a holiday card. But inside, tension brewed like a storm beneath the surface. For weeks, Grace's presence had changed Daniel. The boy who once sat mute now smiled faintly when she read him bedtime stories. He reached for her hand when nightmares came. He even hummed wordless tunes as they baked gingerbread men together. To Grace, these were tiny miracles. But to the staff and Richard's social circle, it was fuel for whispers. The butler clucked his tongue each time Daniel leaned against Grace's shoulder. A maid muttered that Grace wasn't staying in her place. When the chauffeur delivered gossip downtown, tongues wagged faster. By the time Richard escorted his son and Nanny to the Alden Foundation Gala, rumor had already sharpened its claws. The ballroom was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers, velvet gowns, champagne bubbling like liquid gold. Richard, tall and severe in his tuxedo, guided Daniel through the crowd. But it was Grace who kept the child steady, kneeling to whisper comfort when the lights overwhelmed him. Daniel clung to her hand, his face glowing faintly with trust. Cameras flashed, guests gasped. "That's the new Nanny," one woman whispered behind her diamond fan, "parading like the lady of the house." Another man smirked. "He'll marry her by Easter. The black nanny to Billionaire's wife. Predictable, isn't it?" Richard overheard. His chest tightened, old paranoia reawakening. He forced himself to pose for photos, but doubt gnawed at him. Could Grace truly be different? Or was she like everyone else, using kindness as a mask until the fortune lay within reach? The next morning, tabloids screamed their verdict. Alden heir bonds with Nanny, Christmas charity, or secret romance. Another headline sneered. From cradle to crown, Nanny's fast climb in Alden mansion. Paparazzi shots of Daniel clinging to Grace filled the front pages. Richard slammed the papers onto the breakfast table. "Do you see this?" he barked. "This is exactly what happens when I let someone in." Grace, pale but composed, lifted her gaze. What happens? That a child begins to heal? That hope threatens your reputation? His eyes burned. "Don't twist this. You've been here a month, and already society paints you as more than a nanny. Tell me, Grace, are they wrong?" The accusation struck harder than any slap. "You think I planned this? That I used your son's pain as a ladder?" Her voice trembled, but conviction anchored it. "I would never gamble with a child's heart. Never." Richard's silence was worse than words. Daniel, sitting quietly with his cocoa, froze. His spoon clattered. Wide eyes filled with panic. Then he bolted from the room, soundless as always. After that morning, shadows lengthened in the mansion. Staff began treating Grace with thinly veiled suspicion. A missing silver fork was pinned on her until it turned up in the laundry. Her nightly calls to her church were twisted into secret deals. Even Daniel's progress was rebranded as manipulation. Grace endured, shoulders straight, but each rumor carved another wound. One night, she tucked Daniel into bed. The boy slid a crayon drawing into her hand. It showed 3 figures, himself, Grace, and Richard, standing beneath a blazing Christmas star. Grace's throat tightened. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing the paper to her chest. Daniel's lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no sound emerged. His silence was more heartbreaking than ever. The breaking point came days later in Richard's study. The mahogany desk, once the site of his cruel briefcase test, now bore a folder stuffed with clippings. Richard slammed it down. This is what you've brought into my home. Headlines, scandal, disgrace. Grace's voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. No, what I've brought is life. Your son is laughing again. He is remembering what joy feels like. Isn't that worth more than the approval of strangers? For one fleeting second, Richard wavered. He saw truth flicker in her face, but fear clamped down harder. Fear of betrayal. Fear of becoming a fool again. Pack your things, he ordered hoarsely. You'll be compensated. The words hollowed the air. Grace stood frozen, the Christmas tree twinkling faintly through the frosted window behind her. Finally, she drew herself up. No amount of money can buy what you've just destroyed. She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing like a dirge. From the staircase above, Daniel watched, his small frame shaking. He clutched the crayon drawing to his chest, tears brimming in silence. When the heavy doors closed on Grace, it felt like the last light in his world had gone out. And in that moment, though Richard didn't yet realize it, he had banished the only miracle capable of saving them all. Snowstorms swept across Manhattan, grinding traffic to a crawl and turning rooftops into white peaks. Inside the Alden mansion, the air was heavier than the sky outside. Grace was gone, dismissed with cold words and colder silence. The house, once filled with the sound of her soft humming and Daniel's tentative laughter, had reverted to what it had been for years, a shrine of wealth draped in loneliness. Richard tried to bury himself in business. He spent nights poring over contracts, days locked in boardrooms. But no signature, no deal could silence the emptiness at home. He noticed the changes in his son, but refused to name them. Daniel no longer drew pictures. He ignored the grand piano Grace had coaxed him to touch. Worst of all, he stopped looking toward the door with hope. He simply sat in his room, staring at the crayon drawing he had made of the three of them under a Christmas star. The paper grew wrinkled from his small fists, holding it day after day. Richard told himself it was better this way. Better silence than scandal. Better solitude than betrayal. Yet every night he caught his son asleep clutching Grace's scarf, and his chest ached with something money could not soothe. The city still expected the Aldens to appear at the Central Park Christmas tree lighting. Richard considered refusing, but the board pressed. Appearances mattered. He dressed Daniel in a small wool coat, buttoned his own tuxedo, and braced himself for the cameras. The park blazed with holiday cheer. 1,000 voices sang carols as the massive spruce glowed with ornaments. Television crews filmed every angle. Richard forced a smile, shaking hands, while Daniel shrank into the folds of his coat. Snowflakes clung to the boy's lashes. Then, in one careless second, the nightmare began. A jostling crowd surged forward. Richard turned to greet a senator. When he looked back, Daniel was gone. "Daniel!" His shout ripped through the music. Panic roared in his ears. Security scattered, but the park was a sea of strangers, their faces blurred by snow. Richard pushed through, heart hammering. Every shadow looked like his boy, every voice like a clue. Finally, he spotted him, near the frozen pond, drawn by the shimmering reflection of the tree lights on ice. Daniel stood trembling at the edge, boots slipping dangerously close to the cracking surface. "Daniel!" Richard sprinted, but fear rooted the boy to the spot. His blue eyes locked on his father's, wide and helpless. The ice groaned under his tiny weight, and then, cutting through the chaos, came a voice Richard thought he'd silenced forever. "Daniel, don't move, sweetheart!" Grace. She had been nearby with her church choir, distributing blankets to the homeless, when she heard the commotion. The moment she saw Daniel on the ice, she threw off her coat and ran, snow flying behind her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard froze as Daniel's lips quivered. For the first time in years, sound broke free. "Mommy!" The word shattered Richard's pride like glass. It was not meant for him. It was meant for the woman he had cast out. Grace dropped to her knees, crawling across the ice. "Look at me, baby," she coaxed, voice steady, though fear burned in her eyes. "One step at a time. Reach my hand." Daniel whimpered, but when she stretched out her arm, he took it. Grace pulled him close, wrapping her body around his trembling frame. The ice cracked, a jagged sound of doom. With a desperate shove, she pushed Daniel toward Richard, who lunged and caught his son against his chest. The boy sobbed, clinging to him, but Richard's eyes stayed locked on Grace, still on her knees as the ice splintered beneath her. "Grace!" His voice broke. He rushed forward, gripping her arms and hauling her onto solid ground just as the surface collapsed where she had been. For a long moment, they lay gasping in the snow, Daniel wedged between them, the crowd cheering in relief. Back at the mansion, firelight flickered against the walls as Richard watched Grace tend to Daniel with gentle hands, drying his hair, murmuring comfort. The boy leaned into her, exhaustion pulling him toward sleep. In his small fist, he still clutched her scarf. Richard swallowed hard. "You came back." Grace met his eyes, wet strands of hair clinging to her face. "Of course I did. I couldn't leave him, not when he needed me." His chest heaved. The truth hit with crushing force. While he had tested, doubted, and accused, she had been the only one willing to risk everything. For a child not her own. For a family that wasn't hers. "I was wrong," Richard admitted, his voice hoarse. "I thought you wanted what I had, but you gave what I could not. You gave him his voice. You gave me back my son." Grace shook her head softly. No, the miracle was always inside him. He just needed someone to believe. Richard turned toward the fire, his pride collapsing into ash. With trembling hands, he gathered the tabloids, the clippings, the gossip that had poisoned his heart. One by one, he fed them into the flames. Paper curled, headlines shriveled, smoke carried lies away. He faced Grace again, his eyes raw. "From tonight, no more tests, no more suspicion. You belong here, if you'll stay." Grace's lips parted, surprise and relief mingling with tears. She glanced at Daniel. The boy stirred, murmuring one word again, clearer this time, brimming with faith. "Mommy." Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in years, his heart broke open, not from grief, but from gratitude. The miracle he had denied, feared, and tried to control had finally revealed itself. And it wore the face of a child's first word, spoken not to money nor to power, but to love. Christmas morning rose with skies painted soft pink over Manhattan. The storm washed away, leaving snow piled thick like frosting on rooftops. The Alden mansion, long a place of suspicion and grief, now glowed with something new. Warmth. Garlands shimmered in the entryway, pine filled the air, and the crackle of fire carried through the halls. Richard sat in the living room, his son curled against him beneath a wool blanket. Daniel clutched Grace's scarf like a treasure. His lips parted as though even in sleep he was whispering the word that had changed everything. "Mommy." Richard had prayed for years to hear his son's voice, and when it came, it had not been for him. Strangely, that no longer wounded, it humbled him. The miracle wasn't about possession. It was about healing. Grace entered quietly, carrying cocoa topped with marshmallows. Daniel stirred, opened his eyes, and reached immediately for her hand. His voice, still fragile but steady, escaped again. "Stay." Richard turned his face away for a moment, overcome. All the specialists, tutors, and therapies he had purchased with his millions had failed. Grace had succeeded with nothing but patience and love. That afternoon, Richard gathered the staff in the grand hall. Their expressions were wary. Some still remembered whispering against Grace. Standing before them, Richard placed a firm hand on her shoulder. This woman is no longer just a nanny in this house. She is the reason my son laughs again. She risked her life for him. From today, she is family. His voice was iron. And anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. The words hung heavy. The butler bowed his head, ashamed. The maids exchanged glances, chastened. Grace blinked back tears. For years, she had been shuffled from job to job, always seen as replaceable. Now, at last, she was recognized for what she truly was, indispensable. When evening fell, Richard made a decision that stunned even himself. Instead of hosting his usual Christmas Eve gala for New York's elite, he opened the mansion doors to the community. Grace's church choir sang hymns in the foyer. Volunteers decorated the ballroom with paper snowflakes made by neighborhood children. Families from nearby shelters, invited personally by Grace, filled the dining room where a long table overflowed with food. The once sterile mansion burst with laughter. Children raced through halls that had known only echoes. Strangers sang carols beneath chandeliers that had hung in silence for years. And in the center of it all, Daniel walked hand in hand with Grace, a shy smile blooming on his face. At the height of the night, Richard lifted Daniel onto his shoulders so he could place the golden star at the very top of the tree. Grace steadied him as the crowd cheered. Daniel turned, wrapped his arms around her neck, and spoke again, louder this time, ringing through the hall. "Mommy!" The room hushed. Then applause and tears erupted. Guests clapped, some sobbing openly. Richard pressed a trembling hand over his face, undone. He stepped forward and drew both Grace and Daniel into his embrace. "You've given me back my son," he whispered, his voice breaking. Later, after guests had gone and the fire burned low, Richard and Grace stood together watching Daniel sleep peacefully, his small hand still gripping Grace's scarf. Snow fell outside, each flake glowing against the lamplight. Richard turned to her, his voice soft. "I spent years thinking wealth could protect me, that suspicion could keep me safe. But I was wrong. Family matters more than wealth, and Christmas, it still holds miracles." Grace smiled, her eyes wet. "The miracle was always here, Richard. Daniel just needed someone to believe." He nodded slowly. "Then let us believe together, from now on." As midnight bells tolled across the city, the Alden mansion no longer stood as a fortress of suspicion. It had become a home, alive with trust, laughter, and love. Christmas miracles heal the deepest wounds. And that night, under falling snow, 3 broken souls were bound together as one family reborn.